Everyone feared him, yet no one dared to say his name aloud. At Evelyn's place, a diner known for its warmth, his arrival froze the air like a sudden winter storm. Harlan West, the billionaire who demanded respect from all, was treated as if he didn't exist. Waitresses vanished into the kitchen. The cook, who had stood behind the same grill for 30 years, lowered his eyes and pretended to be busy. Even the owner, usually kind to every guest, buried herself in papers. It was as though the entire diner agreed to disappear rather than face him. But on this Tuesday morning, the unspoken rule shattered. At one table, a newcomer remained. Emma Roderick, 62, quietly polishing a coffee mug, unaware that the moment she looked up she would become the first in years to defy Harlan West. And why this tiny act would change everything is the story you're about to hear. Emma Roderick was 62, a widow who had buried the only man who ever stood beside her. Life had not been gentle. It had pushed her through factory shifts, long nights at the truck stop, and years of cleaning houses that never felt like her own. She had worn every kind of uniform, but the one handed to her by Evelyn Shore carried a different weight. The fabric was thin, already faded from countless washings, yet when Emma slipped it over her shoulders, she straightened her back as though it were a garment of honor. Evelyn noticed the calm in her eyes, that quiet steadiness found only in those who had already endured storms. There was no trembling in her hands as she tied the apron strings. Poverty had made her tough, loss had made her tender, and now survival had made her fearless. She needed the paycheck, yes, but what she carried into that diner was something more valuable, a dignity that no billionaire glare could shatter. Across the counter, Maeve Linton glanced at the clock for the 10th time in 5 minutes. 23 years old, bright-eyed on her good days, she looked like a child who had just seen the shadow of a monster creeping under the door. She leaned closer to Emma, whispering so low the words nearly dissolved into breath. "He's coming. When Harlan walks in, don't take his table. Just let someone else." Her hands fumbled with a sugar jar already full to the brim, pouring again as though repetition might keep her calm. Emma studied the girl's pale face, the pulse racing at her throat, and wondered how one man could drain so much courage from an entire room. Maeve's fear did not come from rumor. It was the fear of someone who had lived it week after week, who had learned that survival meant disappearance. In her eyes, Emma saw the warning, but also the question, would she vanish too? From the kitchen doorway, Cliff Banning wiped his hands on a rag streaked with grease. 30 years at the grill had carved lines into his face deeper than the scars from splattered oil, yet nothing aged him like the sound of Harlan West's name. He muttered under his breath, half prayer, half curse, God help whoever has to deal with him today. His voice carried the weight of a man who had seen plenty broken machines, late shipments, winters without heat, yet still believed this one customer was harder to face than any of them. Cliff's eyes, usually steady as iron, flickered with the fatigue of long surrender. To Emma, he looked like a soldier who had lost not one battle but the will to keep fighting. His resignation told a sharper truth than Maeve's trembling. If even the strongest hands in the diner could not stand against Harlan, what chance did anyone else have? And yet, someone soon would. Evelyn Shore had run Evelyn's place for 25 years. She was known for greeting truckers by name, slipping pie onto the plates of lonely widowers, and never letting a child leave without a smile. But on Tuesdays, her warmth froze. When Harlan West's shadow fell across the diner, Evelyn transformed. She stacked invoices that did not need stacking, shuffled pens, already aligned eyes locked on numbers she could not read. The woman who had once faced storms of unpaid bills and broken ovens could not bring herself to meet his gaze. Power, when worn like armor, bent even the strongest spines. In that silence, customers noticed. A diner that usually hummed with chatter became a place where one man's presence smothered the air. If even Evelyn, steady kind Evelyn, hid behind her counter, what hope was left for anyone else? The answer lingered, waiting in the corner where Emma stood. Emma watched the room shrink into itself and could not understand it. Maeve dropped another sugar jar onto a table, already sweet enough fingers trembling as though the crystals were protection. Cliff ducked back into the kitchen, muttering to himself. Evelyn kept her head bowed, adding the same column of numbers again and again. The fear was not hidden. It was displayed in every unnecessary movement, every pair of eyes avoiding the door. Emma tilted her head, brows drawn together. "Is he truly so terrible?" she asked softly, more to herself than anyone else. No one answered. The silence itself was a response louder than words. A paradox lived in that diner. A man who was only flesh and blood had somehow become larger than reason, large enough to make grown adults cower like children. Emma alone seemed untouched, the one soul unbound by this invisible law. Then came the sound they all dreaded, the slow, certain halt of tires against gravel outside. Conversations that had not yet died simply collapsed. The doorbell would chime next, but already the diner braced itself. The silence was thicker than smoke, and when the door swung open, every instinct kicked in. Maeve slipped into the supply closet. Cliff vanished into the kitchen, the clang of his spatula left behind. Evelyn bent lower eyes glued to meaningless paperwork. The air held its breath. Only Emma remained in place, wiping the rim of a coffee cup with calm hands as though nothing in the world had shifted. Her presence was almost defiant in its ordinariness. The first heavy steps crossed the threshold, each one declaring ownership of the floor. And while every other soul disappeared, one truth rang out clear: Emma Roderick was not going to move. Harlan West chose the corner booth, the one no one else dared to touch. He sat heavily, as if the leather seat existed only to serve him. His eyes never scanned the room, not once acknowledging the people who had stilled at his presence. Instead, his fingers drummed a rhythm on the table, impatient, entitled each tap like a warning. The sound echoed into the silence until it felt as though the entire diner beat in time with his irritation. Customers watched from the corners of their eyes, forks suspended coffee cooling. Every heartbeat seemed to ask who would be the first to step into his orbit. But no one moved. The waitresses had vanished, the owner stayed hidden, the cook refused to emerge. The only figure left was Emma Roderick. She breathed in slowly, set down the cloth she had been using, and walked toward him. With each step, the unspoken rule was breaking. Emma arrived at the booth with a smile that carried no tremor. She placed a clean cup on the table and asked in a tone that suggested courtesy rather than submission. Coffee to start, Harlan lifted his gaze, a flicker of surprise quickly buried beneath disdain. His voice was sharp, dismissive, dripping with certainty. "You're new." He didn't frame it as a question. It was an accusation. The billionaire who reduced seasoned workers to shadows expected obedience even in observation. Emma met his stare without faltering. "Yes," she replied simply. "I started this week." She poured the coffee without waiting for approval, steady hands revealing nothing of the tension in the room. Her small act, ordinary polite, stood in shocking contrast to the fear that ruled every Tuesday morning. The clash was subtle, but powerful arrogance met calm resolve, and the diner caught between them leaned forward to see who would flinch first. Harlan leaned back, arrogance returning like a tide. "Bring me my usual," he commanded, his tone carrying the weight of 5 years of expectation. "And don't get it wrong." His words cracked through the silence like a whip. Emma held her pen eyes steady and shook her head slightly. "I don't know your usual," she said evenly. "You'll need to tell me what you'd like." For a heartbeat, the diner froze in disbelief. Conversations died mid-breath, spoons rested mid-air. Customers turned to witness what had never been seen. Someone telling Harlan West no. His jaw tightened, the disbelief on his face sharper than anger. For years the town had bent to his whims, yet here was a woman 3 days into her job who would not bend at all. In that moment, power cracked. A simple refusal held more weight than defiance shouted, and the entire room felt it. Harlan's voice dropped to a growl that carried through every corner. "Do you know who I am?" It wasn't a question, it was a declaration sharpened into threat. For years, those words had been enough to silence anyone. But Emma, steady and unshaken, leaned slightly closer and answered with clarity that sliced through the tension. "I only see a hungry customer. If you don't want to eat, the door is right there." The words detonated in the silence. Forks clinked against plates as customers froze. Maeve crouched behind the counter, pressed both hands to her chest, trembling. Cliff peeked from the kitchen window, his eyes wide as though he had just witnessed a miracle. No one had ever spoken to Harlan West that way inside these walls. The balance of power cracked, and in that crack a surge of satisfaction rippled through the room. One voice had stood against him, and it had not broken. A whisper passed through the diner like wind through dry leaves. "She actually said it," one customer breathed. The silence deepened, not empty but dense, heavy with the weight of disbelief. All eyes returned to the corner booth. Harlan's face flushed crimson, his jaw clenched, and his hand trembled against the table edge. For a moment it looked as if he would explode, shatter the fragile calm with rage. He pushed against the seat muscles tightening to rise. Maeve closed her eyes, certain this was the end of the newcomer. But then, as though some private war was fought and lost within him, Harlan hesitated. His breath caught his hand, dropped, and slowly he sat back down. The decision stunned more than anger could have. Power had not stormed. It had recoiled. The room leaned forward, waiting to see what came next, braced between fury and surrender. Harlan broke the silence with a snap of irritation. Last week the eggs were undercooked. Get it right this time. His words still held edge, but the storm had dulled. Emma drew her notepad steady as ever and repeated each detail aloud with quiet precision. 2 eggs over medium. Wheat toast dry. Hash browns extra crispy. Fresh orange juice. Coffee brewed new. She wrote as though it were the most ordinary order in the world. Harlan frowned, unsettled not by defiance this time, but by normalcy. For years he had demanded attention, reverence fear. Now he was treated as no different from any other guest. Around them, the diners exchanged glances, astonishment. First, then faint smiles. Emma's composure had done more than resist his temper. It had made him ordinary. And for a man like Harlan West, being ordinary was perhaps the deepest cut of all. Emma turned to leave, but Harlan's command cracked through the room. "I didn't say you could walk away." His voice dragged every head toward the corner booth. She stopped, pivoted slowly, her expression composed. "Do you need something else?" The question was plain stripped of fear, but it carried the weight of a challenge. The silence thickened, heavy with suspense. Harlan's eyes narrowed. For a heartbeat his mouth opened, no words coming. Then his fury found form. "My time," he said, leaning forward, every syllable grinding with contempt, "is worth more than you'll make in a year." The sentence landed like a hammer forged to remind her and everyone else of the gulf between them. The diner seemed to shrink beneath the force of his arrogance. Yet Emma stood unmoved, her steadiness cutting deeper than defiance. The insult hung in the air, daring her to break, and every ear strained for her reply. Emma's answer came quietly, but it cut sharper than a shout. "I served you politely. I don't see the attitude you speak of." Harlan slammed his hand flat on the table, rattling the silverware. "Don't play dumb. Do you know who I am?" The words carried the weight of years in which fear had always been the only reply. But Emma did not flinch. She lifted her chin and smiled, calm as still water. "In my experience, the ones who have to remind others how important they are usually aren't as important as they believe." The words struck harder than any insult could. The diner gasped as one body. Maeve peeked out, frozen in disbelief. Cliff stepped into view, spatula in hand, his jaw slack. For a moment, Harlan West, the name on buildings, the face behind donations, was just a man exposed by a truth no one else had dared to speak. The chair screeched across the floor as Harlan shot to his feet. The sound tore through the silence, sharp and jagged. Customers flinched, half rising from their seats, ready for chaos. Emma did not blink. She simply repeated her tone. "Even. So do you want breakfast or not?" The question, stripped bare of deference, hit him harder than mockery. His fists tightened at his sides, the tremor of rage visible in his hands. For a heartbeat, the threat of an explosion filled the air. But then, astonishingly, the fury ebbed. He exhaled through clenched teeth, forced himself back into the booth, the leather groaning under the weight of his surrender. The room released a collective breath, but relief was fragile, tentative. No one dared to speak, knowing the storm was not gone, only paused. And in that pause, Emma had done the impossible. She had made Harlan West sit down. Emma clipped the order to the rail in the kitchen, sliding it toward Cliff Banning. His hands, rough from decades at the grill, froze on the spatula. He leaned in, close voice, low and urgent. "Do you realize what you just did? You challenged the most powerful man in this town." The words carried no exaggeration. Everyone in Miller's Crossing knew that Harlan West's name was carved into half the buildings and stitched into the hospital wing. Emma wiped her palms on her apron, unbothered. "I served him like I would anyone else," she answered, her tone almost casual. Cliff studied her face, searching for fear and finding only calm resolve. His eyes shifted a mixture of dread and something resembling admiration. Behind them, customers murmured at their tables, whispers rising like wind before a storm. The order wheel spun, but the real weight in that kitchen was the name no one dared say aloud. When Emma returned with the plate, the room seemed to tilt toward the corner booth. Harlan sat waiting, not with the restless tapping that had marked his entrance, but with a stillness that unsettled even more. His phone lay untouched beside him, screen dark. His eyes were fixed on the window where morning light caught the outline of the park across the street. Emma set the plate down gently. "Here you are. Try it, see if it's to your liking." Her words were steady, respectful, but not servile. The diner hushed breath caught in dozens of throats. Every detail was noted, the steam rising from the eggs, the scrape of the fork as he tested them, the pause before he brought a bite to his mouth. The smallest change in his expression could tilt the room. Even indifference from him would be a kind of shock. And in that silence the wait stretched unbearably long. Then, without warning, Harlan spoke, not in anger, but in a voice edged with something close to wonder. "Why aren't you afraid of me?" The question sliced through the air more cleanly than any insult could have. Emma stood coffee pot in hand and answered without hesitation. "I lived with a man who carried 500 men on his shoulders every day of his life, and not once did he take his anger out on the waitress at the counter, or the clerk at the bank, or on me." The statement hung in the air, simple, yet impossible to ignore. Nearby diners shifted, uncomfortably astonished she would draw such a comparison out loud. For the first time, Harlan's gaze faltered, his confidence cracked. The silence that followed was not filled with fear, but with thought. The entire diner felt it, the first ripple of change born from one woman's refusal to tremble. Harlan lowered his head and cut into the eggs. For the first time since he had entered, no command followed, no lecture about incompetence. The fork trembled faintly in his hand, betraying what his face would not. He chewed, slowly silent, as though the weight of words had finally become too heavy to carry. Maeve peeked through the narrow slit in the door, her voice a hush of disbelief. "He's quiet." Cliff froze in the kitchen doorway, spatula suspended in midair. Evelyn lifted her head from her meaningless paperwork, eyes wide as if she had just witnessed the sun rise in the west. The diner, which had braced for another storm instead, stood stunned by its absence. The quiet pressed against every wall louder than anger had ever been. For years his voice had defined Tuesdays. Now his silence did, and the room held its breath waiting for what silence would birth. The fork clinked softly against the plate as Harlan set it down. His shoulders sagged, the posture of a man stripped of armor. His words came low, intended for Emma alone, yet they carried across the fragile hush. "Perhaps," he admitted, "I've failed at being human." It was not the voice of a tyrant, but of someone who had finally looked in a mirror. Emma leaned slightly closer, her reply steady but kind. "Failure only lasts if you refuse to change." Around them, customers leaned in, the whispers of curiosity swelling. Snippets of his confession reached their ears, scattering disbelief like sparks. A man they had feared for years was confessing weakness in public. The diner, once smothered by dread, shifted into something unfamiliar, the beginning of compassion. One revelation had broken the rhythm of fear, and as the murmurs grew, Harlan's fortress cracked a little wider, letting something human slip through. Harlan's gaze drifted past Emma, out through the window to the park across the street. There, an elderly man scattered crumbs to a circle of pigeons, his movements slow, content. Harlan's face softened, though the shadow of regret darkened his eyes. "Henry Dalton," he murmured almost to himself. "He worked for me. Retired 3 years ago." Emma followed his gaze, then observed quietly, "He looks peaceful." Harlan's jaw tightened as he nodded. "He told me the best part of retiring was being free from my temper." The admission struck heavier than any insult hurled at him moments before. His own memory condemned him more ruthlessly than the waitress ever could. Emma's silence respected the sting, while the diner absorbed the truth with quiet awe. Power had won him buildings and recognition, but here was Henry-free content unburdened. And Harlan West for the first time looked like a man who longed for that freedom too. Emma's eyes did not waver. "It's never too late to begin again." The words landed softly, but their weight was undeniable. Harlan's throat worked as though the sentence had lodged there. His eyes, always sharp and cold, glistened with a sheen no one had ever seen. The diner remained frozen, every gaze locked on the booth. No dishes clattered, no voices rose. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed distant. The moment itself was the sound. Narration rose within the hush, unspooling like a truth long hidden. This was the moment when the most powerful man in town was disarmed not by wealth or threat, but by a waitress who simply refused to bow. For the first time, the tension that had suffocated the room broke. The release swept through like a tide, leaving relief in its wake. A storm had cracked, and what poured out was not fury but humanity. The story widened, drawing the curtain back. For weeks, Harlan had been moving in disguise, slipping into the businesses he technically owned, but never truly knew. His goal was simple: to test the environment he controlled, to measure loyalty and obedience firsthand. He had stepped into Evelyn's place as part of that experiment, certain he would confirm what he already believed, that power demanded silence, and silence was proof of respect. Yet the mirror he held up to his staff reflected something different. It was not the diner that exposed him, but himself. His arrogance had bloomed so loud it drowned the purpose of his own test. Instead of unmasking others, he had been unmasked. The twist was not that he was undercover, it was that he had nowhere left to hide from his own reflection. In seeking truth, Harlan had stumbled into a truth he had never prepared to face. The admission lingered inside him, calling forth memories he had kept buried beneath years of dominance. Once he had been hailed as brilliant, decisive, unstoppable. But success had carved out its own prison. He remembered the offices that emptied earlier each year, good employees leaving with polite excuses. Assistants who never lasted more than a season, each one departing with the same brittle smile and the same whispered complaint he was unbearable. He saw the empty chairs in boardrooms, the projects delayed, the turnover dismissed as weakness in others rather than fault in himself. And yet the pattern was too clear. He pressed his palm against his temple and muttered, Perhaps I am the reason they left." The confession tasted bitter, but it was his own. For the first time, responsibility settled not as an abstract concept but as an undeniable weight across his shoulders. Emma's voice softened, carrying the weight of memory. "My husband managed 500 men at the copper mine outside Phoenix. Every day he bore the pressure of their livelihoods resting on his shoulders. If he failed, families went hungry. Yet he never once carried that burden into our kitchen at night. He never unleashed it on a bank teller or a waiter or on me." She paused, eyes distant but steady, as though she could still see him stepping through the door after a long shift, dust clinging to his clothes but gentleness intact. He came home, tired, sometimes broken, but never cruel, because he understood that pressure doesn't give you the right to press others down. Harlan's fork lay untouched, his silence heavier than any retort. The story etched itself into the air, a picture of strength without cruelty. And in that picture, Harlan saw a reflection of what he was not and what he might yet become. Harlan's voice broke through, low and raw. "Is it too late for me to change?" The question seemed to tremble between despair and longing. Emma met his gaze and answered with quiet certainty. "Kindness is like a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it grows." For the first time that morning, the ice in his eyes thinned, revealing something fragile beneath. A flicker, hope tentative but alive, lit there. The air inside the diner shifted, losing its suffocating edge. Conversations resumed in whispers, not of fear, but of wonder. Customers exchanged glances, astonished to see not the tyrant but a man struggling with his own humanity. The staff, still cautious, peeked out from hiding. Maeve's hands stopped shaking. Cliff leaned against the pass-through, his eyes wide, caught between disbelief and relief. What had begun as confrontation had become possibility. And, for the first time, people looked at Harlan differently. 1 week later, Tuesday returned, but the air carried a different weight. The familiar black sedan pulled up, yet instead of dread, curiosity stirred. Harlan entered, and this time, Evelyn did not hide. He nodded to her at the register, the gesture small but startling. When he took his booth, his order came with words never spoken here before. 2 eggs over medium, please. Thank you." The syllables hung in the air like something miraculous. Maeve blinked in disbelief, nearly dropping the menu. Cliff glanced out from the kitchen, eyebrows raised high. The customers, once braced for spectacle, now sat in stunned silence. Emma approached with her coffee pot, watching closely. Harlan looked up and gave a brief, almost awkward smile. It was not transformation complete, but it was movement undeniable. The diner felt it a shift, fragile but real, and in that fragile change, hope for more began to grow. Harlan stirred his coffee, the steam curling upward like words he couldn't quite form. At last, he broke the silence. "My assistant quit this morning. She said it was for her health." Emma tilted her head, her tone gentle but probing. "Why do you think she said that?" His jaw tightened, eyes fixed on the cup. "Because I'm difficult. Or maybe, because I'm cruel." The admission hung in the air, fragile but real. He had always framed departures as weakness in others, never a flaw in himself. Now, saying the words aloud, he looked smaller, like a man finally seeing the trail of damage behind him. Emma's reply carried no judgment, only truth. The first step to changing is being willing to admit what's broken. For once, Harlan did not argue. He only nodded slightly, the bitterness of realization already steeped into his silence. Harlan's gaze drifted once again to the window. Across the street, Henry Dalton scattered crumbs to the pigeons, his shoulders loose, his face serene. Harlan's lips moved almost without sound. When he retired, he told me the best part was not having to endure my temper anymore. The sentence carried the weight of a confession, and yet no one had demanded it. Emma said nothing. She let the silence do what her words could not make him hear himself clearly. Around the diner, the atmosphere thickened a heavy curtain of reflection. It wasn't the outburst of a tyrant that held them now, but the grief of a man recognizing the truth of his own cruelty. The contrast was unbearable. Henry free in retirement, light as air. Harlan bound by chains he had forged himself. The sight through the window became a mirror, and for once he did not look away. Emma leaned closer, her voice carrying enough strength to slice through his regret. Change begins today, not tomorrow. The sentence landed firmly, refusing to leave room for excuses. Harlan lifted his eyes, and for the first time they gleamed not with dominance, but with moisture. He nodded once, a gesture small but filled with weight. Around them, the diner stirred back to life, but not with the same rhythm as before. Plates clattered gently, voices rose again, yet the atmosphere was transformed. People glanced toward the corner booth, not with dread, but with astonishment and a trace of cautious hope. Maeve whispered to Cliff, who simply shook his head in wonder. Even Evelyn looked up, her face softening. The man they had all feared now looked like someone standing at the edge of change, and the idea itself, fragile but undeniable, was enough to alter the air they breathed. 3 months later, Evelyn's place no longer held its Tuesday dread. The moment Harlan West stepped through the door, the staff no longer scattered. They greeted him with nods, smiles, even small jokes. He responded in kind, asking about Maeve's evening classes, inquiring after Cliff's grandson, recalling details he would once have dismissed as beneath him. He seemed to take genuine interest, his memory sharper for human stories than for figures on a ledger. When Maeve shyly admitted she was struggling to cover her tuition, he quietly paid the balance without fanfare, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. The old silence of fear had been replaced with a buzz of comfort, the kind that fills a room when people feel safe. Where once his presence had been a storm cloud, now it was the soft warmth of spring, and everyone noticed the difference. One Tuesday, Harlan arrived not alone, but with a young woman at his side. She carried herself with cautious hope, her smile uncertain but eager. Emma approached, wiping her hands on her apron. "And who might this be?" she asked, eyebrows raised. Harlan's voice carried a note of pride he rarely displayed. "This is Jennifer Hale. She's interviewing to be my new assistant, but first I want her to pass a test right here." Jennifer blushed, glancing around the diner as though the walls themselves were part of her exam. Emma chuckled softly, sensing something unspoken. The irony was clear. The man who once used this place to display his dominance now used it to measure humility and character. For Jennifer, the test was simple: survive breakfast with him. For everyone else, it was confirmation of how far he had traveled from the man who first entered with contempt. As Jennifer settled into the booth, she spoke quickly, her nerves spilling into honesty. "He held the door for me, asked about my family, even said, 'Thank you.'" Her words fell into the room like small miracles. Emma's eyes slid to Harlan, a smile tugging at her lips. "You really have changed." Harlan rubbed the back of his neck, his face reddening in uncharacteristic embarrassment. The staff exchanged glances, grins spreading like light through stained glass. Cliff shook his head in disbelief. Maeve laughed softly behind her hand. This was the man who had once turned Tuesdays into nightmares, now disarmed by the simplest compliment. The tension that had defined him had dissolved into humility, awkward but real. And in that moment, no speech or donation could prove transformation more clearly than Jennifer's quiet testimony. The villain of their town had been rewritten by kindness and by choice. Breakfast lingered longer than usual. Harlan no longer ate with hurried precision. He paused, thoughtful pen scratching across a napkin beside his plate. Emma approached, curiosity pulling her closer. "What are you writing?" she asked gently. Without hesitation, he slid the napkin toward her. Across it stretched a list, names scrawled in his neat hand. "People I need to apologize to," he said simply. The words fell heavier than the ink itself. The diner grew quiet once more, as if everyone had seen the sacredness of that scrap of paper. This was no performance, no speech for applause. It was a man cataloging the weight of his own failures. And in that quiet, the list itself became a symbol proof that remorse had finally turned into intent. Emma's eyes traced the napkin. Former employees, old partners, even the name of the boy who delivered his newspaper. The list stretched far longer than she expected. She looked up, voice steady yet tender. The best apology isn't words on paper. It's changed behavior. Harlan swallowed hard, blinking back the mist in his eyes. He nodded slow but certain, as though the truth itself steadied him. Jennifer sat quietly beside him, her silence holding admiration clear on her face. The message carried through the diner like a current redemption isn't won by speeches but by daily proof. It was a truth everyone understood, but few had the courage to speak. And now it had been said aloud, leaving behind a hush that was equal parts painful and freeing. When Harlan rose to leave, he paused at the kitchen window. Cliff stood at the grill, spatula in hand, expecting nothing more than a nod. Instead, Harlan's voice carried across the diner. "Breakfast was perfect. Thank you." The words seemed to stun the room. Cliff blinked, then broke into the widest grin anyone had seen from him in years. Laughter rippled softly, and a light round of applause spread among the tables. It was not for wealth or power, but for gratitude, the kind so rarely spoken by the man who once ruled with fear. The moment shimmered with something undeniable. Respect had replaced intimidation. For the first time, Harlan West left Evelyn's place not as a man others endured, but as a man they could welcome back. Before leaving, Harlan stopped at the counter where Evelyn stood counting receipts. His voice was steady without hesitation. "I'd like to sponsor a raise for your staff. They've earned it." For a moment, Evelyn couldn't speak. Her eyes brimmed her throat tight. At the tables, Maeve pressed her hands to her face, tears spilling freely, her smile breaking through. Cliff leaned out of the kitchen window, shaking his head in disbelief, then grinning like a boy. The news spread in a murmur, then a cheer. Gratitude swept through the diner, filling it with a warmth richer than any donation to a building could ever give. It wasn't just money, it was acknowledgement, respect, finally spoken aloud. The man who once drained joy from this place had now poured it back in, and the room pulsed with relief and happiness. Crossing the street, Harlan slowed his pace and approached the familiar park bench. Henry Dalton sat there, scattering crumbs into the flock of pigeons. Without a word, Harlan lowered himself beside him, reaching into his pocket for a small bag of seed. The two men sat in silence, their hands moving in rhythm, scattering peace into the air. The years of anger, of fear, seemed to loosen their grip as a quiet smile touched Harlan's face. For the first time in memory, his eyes carried ease instead of edge. Inside the diner, Emma watched through the window, her hand pausing on a cup she was drying. She saw not the tyrant who had entered months ago, but a man finally learning how to be human. And that image, simple unspoken, was worth more than all his wealth combined. Yes, everyone deserves a chance to be better. Sometimes all it takes is one person brave enough to say no, and the world of the powerful begins to change. If you've ever faced a Harlan West in your life, share your story, because change might begin with your voice. And if this story moved you, like the video, subscribe to our channel, and help us spread the power of kindness. Then let the silence linger.